The pine boughs were still. Not a breath of wind moving through the Kreminna forest belt at first light. And that stillness was the first problem. A Ukrainian drone crew operating under call sign Berkut 7, attached to the 60th Separate Mechanized Brigade, had been holding observation over a specific forestry track, a logging road cut through the plantation roughly 4 kilometers southwest of Kreminna, since before dawn. Their Mavic 3T had been up 3 times already, battery swaps in the dark, and each pass had come back empty. Dirt road, pine shadows, nothing. Then, on the 4th pass, the thermal lens picked up something that did not belong to the forest. Not one heat signature, not 2, a chain of them, stretched along the tree line like orange beads on a string, each one the unmistakable silhouette of an infantry fighting vehicle sitting with its engine running, waiting. The operator counted, then counted again. 16 BMP-3s, a full battalion's worth of mechanized steel, idling in the pines, pointed west. Within the next 90 minutes, 9 of those vehicles would be burning. The other 7 would be running. What happened in that 3-kilometer stretch of pine plantation is a story about one ambush, but also about a forest Russia has been trying to fight through for 18 months, losing the same vehicles on the same axes again and again, as if the trees themselves were the enemy. This is the reconstruction of that morning, and the pattern it reveals about a military that keeps sending steel into a graveyard it helped build. The Kreminna forest belt sits in western Luhansk Oblast like a long, dark spine. The woodland runs roughly 40 kilometers from north to south, with the town of Kreminna anchoring its eastern edge and a series of Ukrainian defensive positions threading its western margin. For most of 2023 and into 2024 and 2025, this forest became one of the most intensely contested pieces of terrain on the entire front, not because of its strategic depth, but because of what it represented to both sides. The last meaningful buffer before the open ground of the Luhansk operational direction. Russian forces took Kreminna in April 2022 and have held it since. But the town is only as valuable as what it can project westward, and the forest stretching away from it has proven extraordinarily resistant to that projection. The canopy is dense enough to degrade satellite optical coverage on cloudy days. The logging road network is extensive, dozens of tracks cutting through the plantation, each wide enough for a BMP or a light truck, narrow enough to channel any column into a single predictable line. There is almost no room to maneuver off-road. The pines grow close, the undergrowth is thick, and the soil beneath the plantation floor turns to mud with any sustained vehicle traffic. Russia understood this terrain. They had been fighting in it for over a year by the time of this operation. They had lost vehicles here before, many vehicles, and yet the 16th attempt was structurally identical to the first. Here is the tactical situation as it existed in the days before the column moved. The Ukrainian 60th Separate Mechanized Brigade held a defensive arc along the western edge of the forest, anchored on 2 hardened nodes, one to the north of the logging track network, one to the south. Between those nodes, intelligence suggested a gap, not a collapse, not an abandoned position, but a seam in the Ukrainian defensive line where coverage thinned and where a rapid exploitation force, if it moved fast enough and with enough mass, might be able to push through before Ukrainian fire could converge. Russian planners believed they had identified this gap through drone reconnaissance and signals intelligence. According to Ukrainian General Staff reporting from that period, Russian forward observers had been probing the sector for several days with small infantry groups and light vehicles, mapping response times and trying to locate Ukrainian observation posts. The conclusion they reached, that a battalion-scale mechanized push could split the defensive nodes and create a penetration corridor, was not unreasonable on paper. The problem was the intelligence was incomplete, and the forest was never as empty as it looked. The 60th Brigade had been in this sector long enough to understand the terrain with the kind of granularity that only sustained occupation provides. Their commanders had spent weeks mapping the logging road network, not as a defensive liability, but as a targeting system. Every track, every junction, every section of canopy overhead that would force a column to compress. These were not obstacles. They were fireboxes, defined lanes where a vehicle entering at point A would exit at point B, if it exited at all, with virtually no ability to deviate. I spent time going through the available open-source reconstruction of this engagement, and one detail kept returning. The Ukrainian defensive geometry here was not designed as a line. It was designed as a series of overlapping envelopes, each firebox covered by at least 2 observation assets, each observation asset networked to at least 2 strike assets. The forest, which Russian planners hoped would screen their approach, was in fact the mechanism that made targeting trivially simple. A BMP-3 in open country is a capable platform. It carries a 100mm gun capable of launching anti-tank missiles, a 30mm autocannon, and coaxial machine guns. It is amphibious. It can carry 8 infantry in addition to its 3-man crew. Against dismounted infantry in open terrain, it is a serious threat. In a forest track, moving in column, unable to deploy its infantry without stopping, unable to traverse its turret more than a few degrees without hitting a tree trunk. It is a target. The BMP-3 has been Russia's primary infantry fighting vehicle of this war. Oryx open-source tracking has confirmed the destruction or capture of over 500 BMP variants across all types since February 2022, with BMP-3s representing a significant fraction of those losses in the Eastern Theater. The vehicle costs approximately $3.2 million in its current production variant. Russia has them in quantity, but not in infinite quantity, and the replacement pipeline from Kurgan-Mashzavad, the primary manufacturer, has been under sustained pressure from sanctions affecting precision components. 16 of them moving into a forest kill zone represented somewhere between $48 and $52 million in equipment, before accounting for crew, ammunition, and the infantry they carried. Ukrainian intelligence had been tracking the assembly of this force for roughly 36 hours before the column moved. Satellite imagery, though specific commercial imagery from Maxar or Planet for this precise date and location, has not been publicly confirmed, and drone reconnaissance had identified vehicle concentration in a staging area east of Kreminna, consistent with a battalion-level mechanized element. Ukrainian signals units operating in the sector intercepted radio traffic suggesting coordinated movement orders. Forward observers positioned at the forest margin reported engine noise during the pre-dawn hours, the distinctive sound of BMP-3 diesel turbines, which run warm even at idle and produce a heat signature detectable at considerable range on a still morning. The Ukrainian response was not to reinforce the gap. That would have tipped their hand and potentially prompted the Russian force to abort or shift axis. Instead, the brigade's drone unit, operating Mavic 3T thermal quadcopters and modified FPV strike drones, was tasked with continuous observation of the primary ingress tracks, while artillery assets were pre-plotted on 3 specific choke points along the logging road network. The fire missions were registered. The gun crews were ready. All that remained was confirmation of movement. At approximately 5:20 local time, Berkut 7 confirmed the column was rolling. And here is where the most interesting part of this story begins, because the next 40 minutes would reveal not just how Ukraine fights in forests, but why Russia keeps losing in them despite knowing, at some level, what is waiting. The column moved in what Russian doctrine describes as a march formation, vehicles spaced roughly 50 to 80 meters apart, moving at reduced speed to limit dust and noise signature. The lead vehicle, the point BMP-3, entered the first section of the logging track at the forest margin. Behind it, the column stretched back into the open staging area, vehicles feeding into the tree line one by one. The Ukrainian FPV operator, designated as launch authority for the first strike, was watching on a tablet-sized screen, the feed coming in from Berkut 7 overhead. The geometry was almost perfect. The track ran straight for approximately 600 meters before curving left around a dense section of pine growth. The entire length of that straight was visible from a single elevated observation position. Any vehicle that entered the track was committed to that 600 meters with nowhere to go. The first FPV drone launched when the third vehicle in the column had cleared the tree line. The logic was deliberate. Allow enough of the column inside the forest that it could not simply reverse back into open ground while the tail of the column was still exposed enough to be observed. The FPV, a modified racing drone carrying a repurposed anti-armor warhead derived from an RPG round, covered the roughly 800 meters to its target in under 8 seconds. The lead BMP-3 took the hit on its right side in the engine compartment. The vehicle stopped immediately, blocking the track. What happened in the next 6 minutes defined the outcome of the entire engagement. Russia had no good options. The column could not advance past the burning lead vehicle. The track was too narrow, and the BMP-3 was fully blocking it. It could not easily reverse. Vehicles were stacked behind each other at 50-meter intervals, and reversing a BMP-3 at speed on a narrow forest track at low light is an exercise in controlled panic. The infantry could dismount and attempt to push through on foot, but dismounted infantry in dense pine plantation with no air cover and no artillery of their own pre-plotted against an opponent who knows every meter of this ground is not a tactical option. It is a casualty generator. The column stopped. Engines running, thermal signatures blazing on every Ukrainian observation feed. Ukrainian artillery opened on the pre-plotted choke points 90 seconds after the first FPV hit. The fire mission used standard 152mm and 155mm high-explosive rounds, pre-registered on specific track sections where the density of overhanging canopy was highest. Sections where vehicles would instinctively try to shelter. 2 vehicles were hit in the initial artillery strike. One detonated its ammunition almost immediately. Satellite imagery later confirmed a secondary explosion that stripped the canopy from a circle roughly 30 meters in diameter. This is the detail that stuck with me going through the available documentation of this engagement. The canopy that Russian planners expected would protect the column from observation was the same canopy that funneled artillery fire with brutal precision. In open country, a pre-plotted artillery fire mission lands in an area. In a forest track, it lands on a target. A second wave of FPV drones launched from 2 separate positions, targeting vehicles that had begun attempting emergency maneuvers, reversing, attempting to pull off the track. One vehicle that had driven partially into the tree line and wedged itself between 2 pines. Ukrainian operators reported that the confined spacing of the track meant that after the second and third vehicles were struck, the smoke and debris from burning hulks was itself becoming a targeting marker, columns of black smoke visible for kilometers, drawing artillery observers directly to the center of the engagement. Here is a question worth sitting with. If you are a BMP-3 crew in the 5th or 6th vehicle in that column, watching the vehicles ahead of you burn and knowing you cannot advance and cannot easily retreat, what are your options? Comment below what you think a crew should do, because the answer reveals something fundamental about the difference between tactical doctrine and tactical reality. By the time the engagement had run approximately 25 minutes, Ukrainian drone and artillery observers had confirmed strikes on what post-battle damage assessment would put at 9 BMP-3 SES, 5 destroyed outright, 4 severely damaged and subsequently abandoned by their crews. The surviving elements of the column, 7 vehicles, according to Ukrainian brigade communiqués released in the days following, withdrew under smoke and with what fragmentary intercepts described as emergency artillery support from Russian guns firing blind to create a suppression corridor over the track. The withdrawal was not clean. 2 of the 7 surviving vehicles showed thermal damage signatures suggesting near misses, and Ukrainian observers reported abandoned equipment, fuel cans, personal kit, a single RPG-26 disposable launcher, scattered along the track margin where infantry had dismounted under fire and moved on foot rather than wait in the vehicles. 9 BMP-3Cs confirmed destroyed in a 3-kilometer stretch of pine plantation. At approximately $3.2 million per vehicle, that is roughly $28 to $29 million in armor, gone in under half an hour on a single axis against a prepared defense. The most striking part of this assessment is not the number, it is what the Oryx open source database and ISW operational reporting reveal when you pull back to look at the 18 months of Russian mechanized operations in this specific forest belt before this engagement. What those records show is a pattern so consistent it would be almost academic if it were not also consistently lethal. Russian forces attempted battalion or larger scale mechanized pushes along the Kreminna forest logging road network on at least 7 documented occasions in the period from mid-2023 through the date of this engagement. The axes varied, sometimes the northern tracks, sometimes the southern tracks, sometimes, as here, the central network. But the tactical geometry was essentially identical each time. A mass of vehicles, a narrow ingress route, a Ukrainian prepared defense with pre-plotted fire, significant Russian losses, withdrawal, Oryx tracking for the Luhansk direction as a whole, which includes but is not limited to the Kreminna sector, shows confirmed BMP and BMP-3 losses running at a rate that suggests sustained attrition well above Russian replacement capacity in this theater. The cumulative documented losses paint a picture of a force that understands at the institutional level that these forest corridor assaults produce poor exchange ratios and attempts them anyway. Why? Here is the take that will probably get pushback. The answer is not incompetence. It is structural pressure meeting limited imagination. Russian operational commanders in the Kreminna direction face consistent pressure from higher command to demonstrate forward movement, to show, at least periodically, that Russian forces are capable of offensive action on this axis. The forest corridor attacks satisfy that requirement on paper. They can be framed as probing actions, reconnaissance in force, attempts to identify and exploit gaps. When they fail, they can be reported as having achieved partial objectives, having drawn Ukrainian fire, having identified defensive positions. The vehicles lost are the cost of intelligence. In that framing, what this actually produces is a negative feedback loop, where the forest accumulates Russian wreckage, Ukrainian defenders gain increasing confidence in their fireboxes, And Russian crews, those who survive, carry forward the knowledge that entering these tracks is survivable only by luck. What stands out about this pattern is not Russian military culture broadly, but the specific gap between what Russian tactical doctrine says about combined arms coordination and what Russian units are actually able to execute under the conditions of this war. Combined arms doctrine requires synchronization. Artillery suppresses, air cover screens, infantry clears, armor exploits. In the Kreminna forest, Russian forces have rarely been able to achieve more than 2 of those 4 elements simultaneously. Ukrainian drone coverage degrades the artillery preparation phase by forcing Russian gun crews to disperse and relocate. Russian air has been largely excluded from low-altitude operation over this sector since Ukrainian manpads density increased in 2023. Without suppression and without air cover, armor and infantry are left to execute an assault that doctrine explicitly warns against. The gap between doctrine and execution is where those 9 vehicles went. For the Ukrainian 60th Brigade and the attached drone crews, the engagement validated a defensive methodology refined through exactly this kind of repeated contact. The firebox concept, treating the forest not as terrain to be held linearly but as a series of defined kill corridors, has become something close to institutional doctrine on this axis. Brigade-level communiqués from the period, released through Ukrainian official channels, describe the defensive posture in language that emphasizes layered observation, pre-registered fire, and what they term reactive mass, the ability to concentrate strike assets rapidly on any ingress route without maintaining a continuous physical presence on that route. If you have been following this war seriously, this engagement matters for a specific reason. It is one of the clearest documented examples of the Ukrainian military executing asymmetric attrition that does not require numerical equality. The 60th Brigade did not match Russia's 16 vehicles with 16 vehicles of their own. They matched Russia's 16 vehicles with a thermal drone, a handful of FPV operators, pre-registered artillery coordinates, and a forest they understood better than their opponent. The cost ratio is worth pausing on. Ukrainian FPV drones in the current production and procurement environment cost between $400 and $800 per unit, depending on modification. The warheads attached are typically repurposed munitions, adding cost but still representing a fraction of the target value. Even accounting for multiple drone expenditures per vehicle kill, the exchange ratio on this engagement was heavily favorable to Ukraine, perhaps $1 of Ukrainian strike cost for every $40 to $50 of Russian equipment destroyed. The satellite imagery available for this sector from Planet Labs and other commercial providers covering the Luhansk operational area in the relevant period shows burn marks consistent with multiple vehicle destructions along the relevant track system. The marks are geolocatable against known forest track layouts, and their distribution corresponds to the sequence of events described in Ukrainian reporting. OSINT analysts, including those working with the Deep State Tracking Project and Ukrainian volunteer mapping initiatives, have confirmed the general location and scale of the destruction. Now consider this. When you map all 7 documented Russian mechanized pushes in this forest belt over 18 months, placing their approach axes on the same base map, something almost geometrically precise emerges. The routes overlap. Not approximately. They substantially converge on the same track sections, the same junctions, the same choke points. Russian forces have taken fire at the same bend in the road, near what satellite imagery shows as a particularly dense section of pine growth, roughly 1.8 kilometers inside the forest margin, on at least 4 separate occasions. There is a line in one of the Ukrainian brigade communiqués from an earlier engagement in this sector. I am paraphrasing from the Ukrainian original that describes this bend as the corner that knows. It is not poetry. It is a targeting reference that had been in Ukrainian fire plans long enough to acquire a name. Russia, by all available evidence, has never significantly altered its approach geometry to avoid this corner, a force with genuine tactical learning capacity, the kind of adaptation that Ukrainian drone units have demonstrated by constantly varying FPV approach vectors, launch distances, and strike timing to stay ahead of Russian electronic warfare, would have recognized the pattern of losses at this specific point and either changed the axis or invested heavily in suppressing it before movement. Russian forces in this sector have done neither with consistency. The historical comparison is worth making here, and worth asking, does this pattern remind you of anything? In the winter fighting around the Chosin Reservoir in Korea in 1950, Chinese forces repeatedly assaulted the same American defensive positions along the same narrow mountain roads, accepting catastrophic losses in each attempt because higher command pressure demanded forward movement regardless of tactical cost. In the Herkin Forest in late 1944, American forces made the analogous mistake on the attacking side, feeding division after division into a forest that the terrain had already rendered unwinnable on the terms they were fighting on because operational plans required the forest be cleared. The Kreminna forest is not the Herkin, and this is not 1944. But the structural logic, pressure from above to produce forward movement, terrain that punishes the attacking form, a defending force that has adapted its methods to the terrain's geometry, is recognizable across theaters and decades. The engagement also carries specific implications for how drone warfare continues to evolve on this front. The Berkut 7 crew's ability to track 16 vehicles in thermal conditions through a forest canopy, maintain observation while artillery fire was incoming on nearby coordinates, and continue directing FPV strikes through the smoke of burning vehicles. This is not a skill that emerges from a training manual. It is accumulated operational experience, built engagement by engagement, in exactly this kind of scenario. Ukrainian drone operators in the Kreminna sector have, by available reporting, developed specific protocols for forest corridor engagement that differ meaningfully from their protocols for open ground operations. Strike sequencing, hitting the lead vehicle to block the column, then striking mid-column vehicles to prevent organized reversal, then transitioning to artillery for the mass attrition phase, reflects a learned understanding of how BMP columns behave under contact in confined terrain. The operators who ran this engagement had, in all likelihood, been present for at least some of the previous 7 documented contacts in this forest belt. Russia's vehicle crews had not, or if some of them had survived previous engagements, the institutional memory of those experiences was not translating into tactical changes at the column level. This matters beyond the Kreminna front. The Ukrainian military has now accumulated an operational library of forest corridor engagements sufficient to inform defensive doctrine across similar terrain throughout the Eastern Front, the mixed woodland of Donetsk, the river valley tree lines of Zaporizhia, the shelter belts of Kherson. The lessons from the Kreminna pines are being applied wherever Russian forces attempt to use tree cover as an approach screen. And Russian forces continue to attempt it. Subscribe to Frontline Truth if this kind of OSINT reconstruction is what keeps you watching. We do this work every week, tracking the patterns that individual engagements reveal about the larger shape of the war. The aftermath of this specific engagement unfolded over the following 48 hours in ways that tell their own story. Ukrainian drone crews continued observation of the destroyed vehicles through the first day, documenting Russian attempts to recover at least 2 of the damaged BMP-3s that had been abandoned close enough to the Russian-controlled side of the forest margin to be potentially retrievable. Recovery was attempted once, with a truck-based towing vehicle entering the track system under a smoke screen. The attempt was observed by a second Mavic 3T crew holding observation at altitude, and the recovery vehicle was forced to withdraw under FPV threat before it could hook up to either damaged BMP. Both vehicles remained where they fell. Intercepted Russian communications from the sector in the days following the engagement, shared in summary form by Ukrainian military intelligence, described what analysts characterized as blame displacement between battalion-level command and higher. The pattern is consistent with documented Russian command culture under failure conditions. Responsibility for inadequate reconnaissance, inadequate fire support, and inadequate coordination migrates upward and laterally rather than producing structural changes. The battalion that conducted the assault was, according to Ukrainian intelligence assessment, pulled back to a rear staging area within 72 hours of the engagement. Its remaining vehicles were redistributed, and the sector was handed to a different unit. That unit, as of available reporting, has not repeated the mechanized push on the same axis, but has been documented conducting smaller-scale probing actions with infantry and light vehicles, suggesting that the battalion-scale column approach has been, at least temporarily, abandoned in favor of a more cautious methodology. Whether this represents genuine doctrinal learning or simply a bruised unit choosing not to touch the same hot surface twice remains to be seen. The historical pattern on this axis suggests the column attempts will resume. The Pines will be waiting. 3 questions should stay with you after watching this reconstruction. First, could Russia have prevented this outcome if they had invested adequately in electronic warfare and drone suppression before moving the column? The answer is probably yes. Ukrainian FPV operations in this sector have shown vulnerability to certain jamming systems, and the observation advantage Berkut 7 held throughout the engagement was not inevitable. It reflected a Russian failure to contest the electromagnetic environment above the forest before committing armor to the track. Second, what does this pattern of repeated losses on nearly identical axes tell us about the future of the Kreminna direction? If Ukrainian forces can continue to hold the western forest margin with the current defensive methodology, the operational cost Russia is absorbing in this sector may eventually exceed whatever strategic value the axis holds. The question is whether Russian operational commanders will recognize that calculus before it reaches that point, or whether pressure for forward movement will continue to produce engagements like this one. Third, and perhaps most important, the Ukrainian firebox doctrine developed in the Kreminna forest represents a form of terrain-integrated defense that is now being studied by NATO member militaries. What happens when Russian forces or any adversary encounters this methodology in terrain they have not already seeded with vehicle wreckage and hard experience? The Kreminna forest has become a training ground, but its lessons are being learned by both sides on different timelines. Where Russia sees failure, Ukraine has built a template. The 9 burned BMP-3s in the Pines are not just a loss report, they are a proof of concept. If this reconstruction gave you something to think about, a clearer picture of how this war is actually being fought, at the tactical level, in terrain that makes the nightly news but rarely gets unpacked with this kind of detail, subscribe to Frontline Truth. We cover the Russia-Ukraine war with OSINT rigor, unit-level specificity, and the analytical patience that a conflict this complex demands. New investigations every week. The pattern continues. We will keep tracking it.